A perennial herb native to the mountainous regions of southern Europe, contains aromatic compounds so concentrated that 3 leaves can flavor a pot of soup large enough to feed 8 people. The same plant, once established, produces harvestable foliage for 10 to 20 years without replanting, reaches 6 to 8 feet in height, and delivers usable material from every part: leaves, stems, seeds, and roots. For over a millennium, it was grown in kitchen gardens across Europe as a replacement for celery, for stock, for salt, and for the illusion of meat in broths that contained none. It appears in records from Charlemagne's estates, in the herbals of medieval monasteries, in the cooking instructions of Renaissance households. Then the 20th century standardized celery, industrialized bouillon, and decided that herbs should be decorative. The plant did not fail. It simply could not be sold in plastic bags at supermarkets. There is a plant whose leaves contain such concentrated flavor that using too many will ruin a dish. This is not hyperbole. This is instruction, repeated across centuries of European cooking traditions. Use sparingly. A few leaves only. No more than the recipe specifies, or the result will be inedible. Overwhelmed by a flavor so assertive it cannot be balanced. The flavor itself is difficult to describe if you have never tasted it. It resembles celery, but celery amplified several times over. It resembles parsley, but with a savory depth parsley does not possess. It resembles yeast extract, or aged cheese, or the concentrated essence of a broth that has been simmered for hours with bones and aromatics. Food chemists have identified the compounds responsible. Phthalides, the same molecules that give celery its characteristic taste, are present in this plant at concentrations many times higher than in celery itself. The result is a flavor that is immediately recognizable as celery-like, but far more potent. 3 leaves of this plant, torn and added to boiling water, produce a broth. Not a weak infusion. A broth with body, with savoriness, with the kind of flavor that suggests the presence of ingredients that are not actually there. And the plant produces this potency not in small, rare quantities, but abundantly. A single established plant, grown in average garden soil, can yield several kilograms of fresh leaves over the course of a growing season. And it does this year after year, for a decade or longer, from the same root system, without replanting. This is not an annual herb that must be sown each spring. This is a perennial, a plant that, once established, returns every year, growing larger and more productive as its root system matures. In a kitchen garden, this changes the economics of flavor. A celery plant provides stalks for a few weeks before it bolts and becomes unusable. This plant provides leaves from early spring, when it emerges from dormancy, until the first hard frosts of autumn. And it does so for years. Historically, this meant that a household with a single plant had access to a flavoring agent that could replace multiple purchased ingredients. Celery. Celery seed. Stock cubes. Salt, in some applications, because the savory depth this plant provides reduces the need for added sodium. One plant, multiple functions, decades of productivity. And for much of European history, this was not an exotic rarity. This was a standard component of the kitchen garden, as ordinary as onions or thyme. The earliest secure documentation comes from the Carolingian period. In the late 8th century, Charlemagne issued the Capitulare de Vilis, a directive to the stewards of royal estates outlining which crops and plants were to be cultivated. The document lists nearly 90 species, organized by use. Grains for bread, vegetables for the table. Herbs for medicine and cooking. This plant is listed among the herbs, not as optional, as required. Every royal estate was instructed to grow it. The reasoning was practical. The Carolingian Empire, at its height, stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Slavic territories, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The royal household moved frequently, and wherever it stopped, food had to be available. Gardens were planned not for leisure, but for sustenance, and the plants chosen were those that could be relied upon to produce, year after year, without fail. This plant met that standard. By the medieval period, it had become a fixture of monastic gardens as well. The Abbey of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, left behind a detailed plan from the 9th century, showing the layout of the entire complex. The herb garden is clearly marked, divided into sections. This plant occupies a dedicated space, labeled and positioned near the kitchen. Monastic communities, bound by rules that included periods of fasting and meatless days, needed ways to make simple foods palatable. Grain porridges, boiled vegetables, broths made from water, and whatever could be grown. This plant, added to such dishes, provided the savory depth that would otherwise come from meat or fish stock. The same logic applied in peasant households. Meat was expensive. For most of the population, most of the time, it was absent from daily meals. What was available, grain, legumes, root vegetables, needed to be made filling, satisfying, flavorful enough to sustain people through long days of physical labor. This plant made that possible. A handful of leaves, added to a pot of water with oats or barley, transformed porridge into something that tasted intentional, seasoned, almost rich. The flavor suggested the presence of stock, of slow-cooked bones, of resources that were not actually present. And the plant required almost nothing. Once established, it grew without fertilizer, without irrigation beyond what rain provided, without protection from pests or diseases. It tolerated cold, surviving winters that killed tender herbs, resuming growth in early spring when the ground was still frozen at night. By the Renaissance, it appeared in printed herbals and cookbooks. English texts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe it as essential for broths and stews. German and French sources included in recipes for soups, for sauces, for flavoring grain-based dishes. Italian sources mention it alongside parsley and fennel as one of the fundamental aromatics of the kitchen. The seeds, which formed in late summer after the plant flowered, were dried and used as a spice. The flavor was similar to celery seed, but stronger. The stems, when young and tender, were sometimes candied, cooked in sugar syrup and preserved as a sweet, in the same way angelica stems were treated. The roots, dug in autumn, were dried and used in teas and preparations understood as medicinal. This was a plant from which nothing was wasted. Every part had a use, and it persisted in continuous cultivation across centuries. It did not fall in and out of fashion. It did not depend on trade routes or imports. It simply grew in the same gardens, tended by people who had learned from their parents how to use it, who passed that knowledge to their children. Until the knowledge stopped being passed, the plant did not fail. But by the late 19th century, industrial food systems were beginning to reshape what people ate and how they obtained it. Celery, which had been known in Europe for centuries but was less commonly grown than this plant, underwent a transformation. Breeders in France, England, and the United States selected for milder flavor, for thicker stalks, for varieties that could be blanched to reduce bitterness. The result was a vegetable that could be eaten raw, that had a crisp texture and a flavor gentle enough to appeal to mass markets. Celery could be grown at scale, fields of it, acres. It could be harvested mechanically, or at least with greater efficiency than most vegetables. It could be bunched, packed, and shipped to urban markets, where populations no longer grew their own food. And celery was annual. It had to be planted every year, which meant seed companies could sell seed every year. Farmers could sell fresh product every season. There was a recurring market, a continuous flow of commerce. This plant, by contrast, was perennial. A single plant, once established, required no further purchase. There was no recurring revenue. And because the flavor was so strong, a household needed only one plant. Maybe two. Not a row. Not a field. Just one plant, growing in a corner of the garden, supplying enough leaves for years. From a commercial perspective, this was a problem. Supermarkets, which became the dominant source of food in the mid-20th century, required products that could be handled, stored, and displayed. Fresh herbs had to survive harvest, transport, refrigeration, and time under lights. They had to look appealing in packaging. This plant's leaves were large, tender, and wilted quickly after cutting. They did not fit neatly into the small plastic clamshells that became standard for fresh herbs. And the flavor was too strong for consumers who had been raised on mild processed foods. Celery, by comparison, was perfect for the system. Mild, crisp, uniform. It could be used in large quantities without overpowering a dish. It appealed to palates that had learned to associate blandness with refinement. and industrial food manufacturers found ways to replace the need for fresh aromatics altogether. Bouillon cubes, stock powders, soup bases made from salt, monosodium glutamate, and dehydrated vegetables. These products were cheap, shelf-stable, and consistent. They required no preparation, no knowledge of how to use fresh herbs, no understanding of flavor balance. For a population increasingly disconnected from food production, these substitutes were easier. They required no garden, no knife skills, no experience. This plant, which had been used daily for over 1,000 years, required all of those things. It required knowing how much to use. It required understanding that 3 leaves were enough and 30 would ruin the dish. It required a relationship with the plant, an understanding of its strength. And that relationship was no longer being taught. Cookbooks aimed at modern audiences stopped including it. Recipes called for celery instead, or for bouillon cubes. Seed catalogs, which once listed it as a standard garden herb, dropped it in favor of parsley, basil, and dill, herbs with milder flavors and broader appeal. Agricultural extension services, which in earlier decades had advised home gardeners on growing it, shifted focus to ornamental plants and vegetables that could be sold commercially. By the 1970s, most people in Europe and North America had never heard of it. It persisted in a few places, old gardens where it had been growing for generations, ethnic communities that remembered it from their countries of origin, the collections of historical plant societies. But it did not flavor anyone's soup. It did not grow in anyone's kitchen garden. It simply existed, unrecognized, in the margins. Modern chemical analysis has mapped the compounds responsible for the plant's extraordinary flavor. The primary contributors are phthalides, including 3N-butyl phthalide and sedanolide, the same molecules found in celery, but at concentrations 5 to 10 times higher depending on growing conditions and plant maturity. These compounds are perceived by the human olfactory system as intensely savory, with celery-like and umami characteristics. The plant also contains terpenes and other volatile oils that contribute complexity, hints of anise, of parsley, of earthiness. The overall effect is a flavor profile that resembles a finished stock or broth, despite being produced by a single plant with no fermentation, aging, or cooking beyond the simple act of steeping in hot water. This makes the plant highly efficient. Where a recipe might call for multiple stalks of celery, or a tablespoon of celery seed, or a stock cube, a few leaves of this plant achieve the same effect with less volume, less processing, and no added sodium or preservatives. Nutritionally, the plant is more than a flavoring agent. The leaves contain significant levels of vitamin C, vitamin A in the form of carotenoids, and B vitamins including folate. Mineral content is notable. Potassium is present in concentrations comparable to spinach, and calcium, magnesium, and iron contribute to overall nutrient density. Historically, the plant was understood as a spring tonic, one of the first greens available after winter, consumed to replenish nutrients depleted by months of stored foods. Modern analysis supports this traditional use. The combination of minerals and vitamins in the early spring leaves would have addressed deficiencies common in pre-industrial diets. The plant's traditional use to support digestion aligns with the presence of bitter compounds and volatile oils that stimulate gastric secretion and bile production. This is not a medical claim. It is an observation of chemistry that corresponds to centuries of recorded use. From an agricultural perspective, the plant is resilient. It is cold-hardy to at least USDA Zone 3, surviving winters that reach -40 degrees Celsius. It tolerates poor soils, though it produces more abundantly in rich, moist conditions. It grows in full sun or partial shade. Once established, the root system is deep and extensive, making the plant drought-tolerant and difficult to kill. The plant flowers in midsummer, producing large, flat-topped clusters of small yellow-green flowers. These are highly attractive to pollinators: bees, hoverflies, parasitic wasps. In garden ecosystems, this makes the plant valuable beyond its culinary use, supporting beneficial insect populations that contribute to pollination and pest control. The seeds, which mature in late summer, are viable and can be saved for replanting. But the plant is more commonly propagated by division. Established clumps are split in early spring, producing new plants that are genetically identical to the parent. Productivity increases with age. A young plant in its first year produces modestly. By the third or fourth year, when the root system is fully developed, production can reach several kilograms of fresh foliage per season. And this continues year after year for a decade or more. From a food security perspective, this is a plant that provides long-term, low-input nutrition and flavor. It occupies minimal space, requires minimal care, and delivers a yield that far exceeds what most annual herbs can provide. The plant is called Lovage. The name is English, derived through Middle English and Old French from Latin, though the exact path of transmission is debated. In other European languages, it carries different names: Livish in French, Liebstöckel in German, Levistico in Italian, Lubacek in Czech. The variation reflects its widespread historical use across linguistic boundaries. It grows today where it has always grown, in the cooler regions of Europe, from Britain to the Balkans, from Scandinavia to the northern Mediterranean. It is found in old cottage gardens, in the herb gardens of restored monasteries, in the plots of gardeners who learned about it from family or from books on historical plants. In recent years, it has begun to reappear. Seed companies specializing in heirloom and rare varieties now list it. Some farmers markets in Europe and North America sell fresh bunches. Chefs interested in historical cuisine or in assertive, distinctive flavors have begun using it again. The plant is unmistakable. It grows tall. Mature specimens commonly reach 2 meters, sometimes taller. The leaves are large, glossy, dark green, divided into wedge-shaped leaflets that resemble celery leaves, but on a much larger scale. The stems are thick, hollow, ridged. When it flowers, the umbels, flat-topped flower clusters, can be 20 centimeters across, composed of hundreds of tiny yellow-green blooms. After flowering, the seeds form, oval, ridged, aromatic, resembling celery seeds but larger. Harvest is straightforward. Outer stems are cut near the base, leaving the central growing point intact so the plant continues producing. The leaves can be used fresh or dried. Drying intensifies the flavor, so dried lovage is used in even smaller quantities than fresh. The flavor is best described as celery concentrate. It is savory, slightly sweet, with an earthy undertone. It is not delicate. It does not fade into the background. It defines the dish it is added to. Traditional uses remain the best guide. Add it to soups, stews, and stocks. Use it with potatoes, beans, grains, foods that benefit from deep, savory flavor. Pair it with fats, butter, cream, olive oil, which carry and soften its intensity. The stems, when young, can be eaten like celery or blanched and used in cooking. The seeds, dried and ground, function as a spice. The roots, though rarely used in modern cooking, were traditionally dug in autumn and dried for later use. For gardeners, lovage is among the easiest perennials to grow. It is started from seed, or from divisions of established plants. Seeds germinate slowly, 2 to 3 weeks, but reliably. The young plant grows steadily, forming a small clump in the first year. By the second year, it begins to reach mature size. By the third, it is fully productive, and from that point, it requires almost nothing. Water during dry spells, a top dressing of compost in spring. Otherwise, it simply grows. It does not need to be staked. It does not need to be divided unless the clump becomes too large for the space. It does not suffer from serious pests or diseases. It simply returns every spring, as reliable as the calendar. For those who want a plant that delivers flavor without replacement, that asks little and gives abundantly, that connects them to a tradition of cooking that stretches back over 1,000 years. Lovage has no peer. It never disappeared from the gardens that remembered it. It still grows where it was planted decades or centuries ago, still flavors soups in kitchens across Europe, added by hands that learned from hands that learned from hands, in an unbroken chain of knowledge. And it is still here, waiting in the corners of old gardens, in the seed packets of those who preserve what nearly vanished. The knowledge was always here. It was written in Carolingian estate records, in monastic garden plans, In the recipes of grandmothers who never wrote anything down but taught by doing, we just stopped tasting.